Van Glow, drag queen and host of the Vanity Project podcast. Thank you for joining us here this morning. We have this conversation an awful lot without actually hearing from any drag queens. So, first of all, for those of us who don't know, what is Drag Queen Storytime and what is it aiming to do?
Well, first of all, I have to say, and thank you for having me on to discuss this, Drag Queen Storytime, for me, as a principally adult entertainer, I can't think of anything more tedious than reading to children. It's essentially an initiative in which drag queens who are bright and colourful, performing the role, similarly to a clown, want to read to kids as something fun for the kids to do. Now, taken at face value, that is literally all it is. And I think that people have become... I can understand why people have become upset, why there's consternation around it, but I think they have a misapprehension about what drag is in these contexts. Because if you come to my show, it's quite spicy. There's a lot of adult humor, but there is a whole subgenre of drag. In fact, there's a whole subgenre of traditional British drag and panto, which is perfectly acceptable for kids. And so it's kind of inappropriate to be protesting that.
So you say that you do understand, though, why people might be upset by this. What do you think that is?
I think there's a couple of things. I think we suffer from a kind of cultural erosion in this country where, as we know, when America gets a cold, the whole world sneezes. And so the debates that take place over the pond tend to take place over here shortly thereafter. America doesn't have a tradition of the panto dame. If you look at Auntie Titania, who was reading the stories to the kids in Norwich, I mean, she's more or less a panto dame, and we've all been familiar with panto dames growing up. But also we have to remember that a lot of people are thinking of Lily Savage. They're thinking of of blue language, salty stories. They might even be thinking of burlesque and erotic striptease. Now, all of these things are part of the world of drag, but that's not necessarily the drag that's being put in front of kids in Drag Queen Story Hour. So the confusion comes, I think, it might be from some people might be watching this who don't realize that within drag, it's an art form. There's so many different expressions of that artistic work.
Do you think, I do find this absolutely fascinating, Vanity, this story, because there is a sense that there is a kind of a growing anti-science approach to gender. What is a man? What is a woman? We're all hearing this debate. Politicians are given this as a kind of gotcha interview question. We're going to work out who you are if you can't tell us what a woman is. And there is some truth in that with this loss of gender boundaries does concern people. I am one of them as a mother of daughters and sons as to how children are understanding this. But are you saying that you think this is a very separate topic to a man in a dress, a bit like Widow Twankey, going to a library and reading a story? Do we have to separate those two issues?
I think that we can appreciate that there is some connection in a world where people are learning or considering different ways to express their identity. There is a connection between what drag performs as an art form. It performs a role that's mind-opening. I think some people feel like transgender ideology is being smuggled in the back door via Drag Queen Story Hour. But I don't think that's why Auntie Titania is going to read to kids. You know, Auntie Titania is a human being. She may have nieces and nephews. She may have children of her own. I don't know. And actually, it's delightful, I'm sure, for her to read to kids. And I have to tell you, I must reiterate, I personally cannot think of anything worse than having to read to kids. But that's not the kind of show that I'm doing.
But I suppose that's part of you know, I have to read to my kids, and believe me, it is flipping boring when you read the same story every night, and they want the same story when they're little particularly, and you read that same book 25 times a week. So therefore, it does make people suspicious, doesn't it? That's why they say, well, why does she want to be there? What is her ulterior motive? Why doesn't she do it maybe just dressed as her? If this is what she likes to do, why doesn't she just do it as her normal self without a dress?
Well, that's not something that you would say to a clown, and it's not a suspicion that you would superimpose onto a comedian who's maybe doing comedian story hour. The art form of drag does involve being dressed in colourful and gender-bending ways. I understand the root of suspicion is always a lack of information or ignorance.
Yeah.
And I totally accept. Like I've been performing in the dungeons of Soho for many years. Not everyone comes to shows like mine, so they don't understand where drag is, what drag could be, and why in some instances it might be okay for kids. That's why I think it's important, and I'm grateful to have been asked on to
Mm.
talk about it. I think it's important that people in my line of work come and have this conversation with people who are confused or don't understand or are just thinking, what's going on over there?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I think the idea that this is not necessarily in the same Venn diagram of trans activism or trans ideology, that's what people worry about. I guess what you're saying is an underappreciation of the artistic art of drag and performance. Again, I can
Well, it's
imagine,
quite free.
I can hear the inbox beeping now with emails coming in saying, but this isn't appropriate for children.
Well, I mean, it's for people to decide what's appropriate for their children. I know some people seem to have this thing where they really can't separate drag from innuendo. And I know drag queens have spent many years making innuendos, myself
Yeah,
included.
that's kind of the
Um,
point.
but what they might not be aware of is that drag has had a total explosion in the last half decade. And there's a whole genre of drag that it isn't about that saber-toothed satirical kind of approach anymore. For a lot of drag queens, it's kind of a form of Disney princess performance. Now, I find that a little bit tedious, but I can totally see why kids would love it.